Hi, this is Module 3 of our course, Ethical Practice Through Evidence-Based and Culturally Responsive Disability Evaluations, Clinician Supervisors and Administrators and Researchers as Agents of Change. So this Module 3 looks at the SLP Changemakers, the clinicians. And we're going to hear from 3 clinicians who have worked as bilingual speech-language pathologists, bilingual and monolingual evaluations. They're all bilingual in Spanish. And what they have done and why they have done it, and how changes have happened in entire districts because of their work. One is Lorena Diaz, Tamara Naparstek, and Julie Smith.
Hello, I'm Lorena Diaz, and I'm a bilingual SLP, currently working in a small city in New York State. I'm going to share my personal challenges in providing evaluations that are both reliable and fair for the bilingual population. At the start of my career, during my CFY, I worked at a preschool in the Bronx where my caseload consisted mainly of children where Spanish was the primary language in the home. Most of my students' families were primarily from the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and from Mexico. Since my family is from Puerto Rico and I have a background very similar to my students in terms of language acquisition, as well as socioeconomic status, I felt great about being able to help these children in the best way I knew how. I was excited and eager to put into my professional practice everything I had learned in grad school about assessment. And I did so right away, as there was apparently a huge need. I had been taught that you evaluate students with the standardized test, at the time was the PLS-3, in both languages, score it, and the results would answer the imperative question as to if the child had a speech disorder. Simple, neat, and clear cut. However, after administering a few tests in this manner, I knew there had to be a better way. With the PLS, I felt there were unreasonable expectations in terms of time and attention to task for students who were so young. But more impactfully, these results were not reading the kids right. Very often, these children that the testing suggested had a language disorder, I would then see for treatment, and most of them would be able to follow multi-step directions, tell a story cohesively, answer questions with relevant answers, and so on. Here I would have these students in front of me, accomplishing all these tasks, often with ease, yet the test was finding all sorts of issues with comprehension, following directions, and recall. I took my Bilingual Extension Institute at Teachers College, which answered a lot of my questions, and I read the relevant research. I learned why my results were not a clear representation of these children, as well as all these other evaluations that I was coming across. They weren't accurate either. Our findings were not coinciding with the students' abilities. Many of these children were misdiagnosed, and being misdiagnosed can have long-lasting effects. I needed to assess in a culturally responsive way in order to get accurate results. Armed with this new knowledge and with a renewed sense of purpose, I assessed my first student using culturally responsive research-based methods, and I handed in my report to my supervisor. I had explained some of what I was learning already at an in-service to the speech department, and I hoped that seeing it on paper, they would be excited too. Instead, the report was returned to me with the directive to redo it and put the scores in. You can't hand in a report like that, I was told. This was definitely not the reaction I was hoping for. I felt upset, embarrassed, and frustrated. I called the school director and asked for a meeting so I could discuss this report, and also why I no longer felt comfortable conducting reports the way they had been done in the past. The director listened and was kind in her demeanor, but ultimately I was told to keep using standardized tests and to continue inputting scores. Needless to say, I was crushed. They were asking me to potentially label a child as having a disorder when they do not have one, to label a child with a disorder when they do not have one, as lasting repercussions in terms of limiting their growth, their potential, both academically and just in their life in general. It is not accurate. Interestingly enough, the same agency I worked for had several schools across the city, one being in Manhattan. The school in Manhattan accepted culturally responsive evaluations. So I requested a transfer that was granted, and I was then able to work in an ethical manner. My next phase as an SLP took me to the New York City Department of Education, where I was one of 5 speech therapists in an elementary school. I was the sole bilingual provider, and I began conducting evaluations for the DOE. These evaluations needed to be reviewed by a bilingual speech supervisor before being accepted. This created some tension, as she often did not agree with my findings or understand the way I conducted the evaluations, as they were presented in a descriptive manner rather than score-based. I received a lot of pushback from the bilingual speech supervisor, and she would actively attempt to have me change my findings. We had several discussions where I spoke to her about what I had learned and the repercussions of continuing to rely on standardized testing for our population. And over time, the bilingual supervisor began researching appropriate evidence-based practice and enhanced her knowledge base with trainings. She slowly began to change her views and actually became a strong advocate for conducting evaluations fairly. I then moved to a small city and faced a new host of challenges. Here, I found that though some of the SLPs where I worked did not report scores, they were still using standardized tests such as the SELF, the ROW PVT, EOW PVT in their entirety. So even though scores were not reported, the children were often misdiagnosed continuously, as their results were essentially still based on those tests that are often measuring aptitude with standard American English, rather than if a child has a speech and language disability. Luckily, the speech chairperson was open to discussing why my evaluations were done differently than other bilingual SLPs. The chairperson often had to participate in IEP meetings where I was not present and review my speech evaluations to the entire team. In doing so, she came to understand why it was so important to use methods that were culturally responsive. At this point, I was untenured, an at-will employee, meaning they didn't need a reason to let me go. They could just do so at any time. I had a meeting with the superintendent of special education where I explained my evaluations and why I relied heavily on dynamic assessment and used a descriptive manner rather than standardized tests. However, the superintendent could not understand why the bilingual SLPs in the district were not all on the same page. Why was it that if what I was saying was correct, I was the only one doing it that way out of several bilingual SLPs? And that question was a difficult one to answer. I just kept stating that I was following evidence-based best practice from my students. I shared research. I kept explaining what's in my power to do. Whatever was in my power to do, I did. Whether or not I would lose my job, I needed to continue servicing these kids. There's no reason why they should be labeled as having a disability when they do not. That is unacceptable. In the end, culturally responsive evaluations are not only fair and just, they are accurate. The results of an evaluation using methods that don't distinguish between a difference and a disorder is inaccurate and a disservice to the population we serve. Though I continue to face challenges and obstacles in providing evidence-based and culturally responsive evaluations, there really is no choice. There's no other way but what is just and what is fair. Though it's often an uncomfortable position to be in and it feels uncertain, it can be tough. Not everybody's on board, not everybody understands, and they're not familiar with what the research states. Having said that, there is no other way to go about this but to keep going one day at a time. Though I had challenges, I still received tenure at 2 different workplaces. I was never left without work. I may have had to transfer, but I was able to sleep at night then. And a crucial discussion began. At my current workplace, no one is using scores. Dynamic assessment is beginning to happen in evaluations. And tomorrow there's actually a speech department meeting where we're going to discuss why there's disproportionate referral, especially at the secondary level. The discussion continues, and it's very necessary. To be a bilingual SLP often goes hand in hand with being an advocate. The opportunity to create change is both an honor and a privilege. Will you be an agent of change?
Hi, I've been working as a bilingual speech language pathologist for the past 11 years in New York State. Most recently, I'm in my 5th year as a school-based speech language pathologist. I'm going to talk today about some of the challenges and successes of conducting equitable evaluations within the school system. I'll start by taking a look at the diverse suburban school district where I work and some of the student demographics. Let's start by looking at elementary school A. You'll see that the majority of students in this school identify as white and are economically advantaged. 9% of these students are classified with disabilities. Compare that to elementary school B, where about half of the student population identifies as Latinx and is economically disadvantaged. The classification rate in this school doubles to 18%. So we know that there's likely an over-identification of culturally and linguistically diverse students. So what are some of the things that I'm hearing in the schools? Can I just administer the SELF-5 and not report the test scores? No, because the bias exists in the standardized tests, not just in the scores that are reported. Why does the student even need a bilingual evaluation? He, she, or they doesn't even speak Spanish. There are key factors that need to be included for every evaluation, such as the influences of culture, language, socioeconomic status, parental education, and academic history, such as interrupted education. These factors cannot be ignored, even when a child is not fluent in a language other than English. I can't see the student. He, she, or they speaks a language other than English, and I can't use my regular screener or test. This type of statement is problematic. One, because there aren't enough bilingual speech language pathologists to do all the work for culturally and linguistically diverse students. And also because every evaluator needs to understand the various and unique experiences of a student. Also, this directly connects to the ASHA Code of Ethics, which states that clinicians have an ethical responsibility to not discriminate based on race, ethnicity, language, or dialect, among other factors, and to enhance and refine our professional competence and expertise. We must fill in the gaps after graduate school and stay current on the research and best practices. One of the best outcomes of the comments that I hear in the schools is that it's opened up dialogue with my colleagues. It's allowed me to fill in the gaps of misunderstanding. These conversations are a start because they begin to create awareness. One of the greatest challenges that I've faced is that psychologists who serve as leaders and chairpersons on the Committee on Special Education continue to rely primarily on test scores. We'll remember that federal special education law requires that all assessment materials be free of cultural and racial biases and distinguish a true disability. So which one of the standardized tests can do this? None of them can. So many psychologists rely on a tool called the Culture Language Interpretive Matrix. This tool was developed in 2013 to evaluate the extent to which developmental language proficiency and cultural learning opportunity affect the validity of standardized test scores for individual students. It was created to answer the question, are the students' observed learning problems due primarily to cultural or linguistic differences, or in fact, a true disorder? Sounds like an amazing tool, but where is the research to show the construct validity of this interpretive approach? There's none. No empirical studies have been published in peer-reviewed journals to validate the use of this tool. So what does the CLIM research say? Well, there's a growing body of research, including peer-reviewed articles and dissertations from 2013 to 2022 that raise the question about the validity of using the CLIM to make clinical decisions. Studies indicate that the CLIM does not accurately measure cultural and linguistic demand of standardized tests as intended, and indicates a low accuracy for distinguishing individual students. The research article from this year, 2022, shows the results that the CLIM makes individual decisions only at slightly higher than chance rates. When we look back to the peer-reviewed article from 2013, the evidence showed that it identified English language learners at chance levels. So it's about as accurate as flipping a coin. Additional CLIM research using a variety of cognitive measures all have found the same lack of validity. The empirical evidence suggests that the CLIM-based decisions may too often work against its intended purpose. So what does this mean? It means that English language learners may be incorrectly under or over identified with a disability when this tool is used. So why is the CLIM still being used? Even after sharing the research on the CLIM's low accuracy, some psychologists may continue to use the tool. While I was able to shift the thinking in my direct colleague, we still see its continued use. Well, some clinicians don't use valid tools. And not all clinicians know how to do a valid, culturally and linguistically responsive evaluation. This is as true in psychology as it is in speech language pathology. This is a clear example of a practice that is not consistent with the current research. So, what can be done? Again, we look back to the ASHA Code of Ethics, and we find that it requires collaborative work, not just with members of one's own profession, but with other professionals as well, in order to deliver the highest quality of care. So we have to come together for the best interest of students. So what are some of the solutions? In my own district, we formed a district-wide interdisciplinary evaluation team. This includes myself as the bilingual speech language pathologist and a bilingual school psychologist. We conduct all of the initial referrals to the Committee on Special Education. Our district has shown clear over-identification of students with cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic differences. So one of the primary goals of the evaluation team is to create equity across the schools. So despite the differences we saw in individual schools based on student demographics, decisions won't be based just by a student's background, but based on using evidence-based evaluations or evidence-based practice, like process-based and dynamic assessment that reflect a student's learning and does not simply rely on standardized test scores, so that we can accurately distinguish between a difference and a true disorder in each student. Other things we use is obtaining background information on each student. So information that includes their academic records, teacher reports, observations, and parent interviews, so that we're collecting data from multiple sources and various environments. One of the most important pieces of the evaluation team has been building allies. We've gained administrative trust and support of our professional practices. And most importantly, I've built a strong professional relationship with my colleague, a school psychologist, demonstrating that these strong relationships are possible across disciplines. We have an excellent rapport and working relationship. We share resources and research. We learn from each other, and we discuss these concerns openly. So based on the success of the multidisciplinary evaluation team, how can we create district-wide solutions? By forming a culturally and linguistically appropriate disability evaluation task force. This will allow us to address systemic racism and implicit bias head-on within the district. For one, those that opt in and are interested in developing their clinical skills are more likely to be open-minded and already advocating for change. We'll review current district statistics and identify the key issues that need to be addressed. Just as on the evaluation team, the administrators are likely to be very motivated because more accurate evaluations reduce the disproportionate identification of English language learners and minority groups in special education. We'll train additional professionals as chairpersons for the Committee on Special Education. This will shift some of the power and allow a different perspective. We'll learn together as colleagues, sharing evidence-based practice and the current research. Share less bias and more valid assessment materials, and discuss the practical implementation of these tools. Very often when students are assessed, while they may not have a true disability, there may still be interfering factors on these students accessing their curriculum, and thus they'll need RTI support programs. We'll invite families to share culture, language, and values so that we can learn about all of our communities in the district. And lastly, in order to share the work of the task force, we'll provide in-service workshops so that everybody can be trained and learn from this work. It takes time for change to happen, but it does happen. In the past 5 years, I've seen positive changes and improvements as I push for equitable evaluations in the district. The evaluation team formed in my district is a multidisciplinary model for conducting appropriate evaluations for all students. This will be a continued catalyst for positive change in the future. Thank you.
My name is Julie Smith, and I am a bilingual Spanish-English speech-language pathologist and doctoral student at Teachers College, Columbia University. My clinical work involves conducting Spanish-English bilingual speech and language disability evaluations. I primarily work with preschool-age Spanish-English dual language learners, or DLLs. DLLs are a highly culturally and linguistically diverse population. I've evaluated a mix of simultaneous and sequential DLLs who speak a variety of Spanish and English dialects. In Northern Manhattan, I've worked mostly with speakers of Dominican, Puerto Rican, and Mexican Spanish. Upon entering the field as a master's student and clinical fellow, I noticed the widespread use of standardized assessments. Many of the IEPs on my treatment caseload were based primarily or entirely on standardized test scores. And across workplaces, it seemed to be the default procedure for diagnostic evaluations. Given the lack of research evidence supporting the use of standardized assessments and their role in the disproportionality of DLLs in special education, I saw an acute need to shift this long-standing practice. However, I was weary of how challenging this could be. Change often creates friction, and with the amount of paperwork that all educational professionals are responsible for, there never seems to be enough time to implement change. Still, ASHA's Code of Ethics prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, culture, language, or dialect, and mandates compliance with local, state, and federal laws. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA federal law, prohibits the use of inaccurate discriminatory assessment materials and the use of single measures for the determination of disability status. So, in compliance with both professional code of ethics and federal laws, I only feel comfortable using multiple evidence-based measures of language development and disorder, along with my clinical judgment. Because standardized assessments aren't accurate, my evaluations include parent-caregiver ethnographic interviews, teacher interviews, clinical observations in pull-out therapy and push-in classroom settings, dynamic assessment and non-word repetition task performance, and language sample analyses. Figuring out ethical alternatives to standardized assessments was the easier part. Justifying them to my colleagues and superiors was more daunting, however. But I found a way to make change a little easier for my audiences. Following the writing advice of one of my clinical supervisors at Teachers College, I aimed to package my rationale in a concise and precise argument. I knew I had to be brief enough to get my points across in a short email, conversations between sessions, and at the top of my reports. And to justify significant change to a deeply entrenched practice, I knew that these had to be direct and provide an unequivocal argument for change. I found that the best way to do that was by citing the ASHA Code of Ethics, IDEA federal laws, and the research evidence. However, I also wanted to avoid coming off as antagonistic because the goal of these exchanges is to foster understanding. So I take special care to use a collegial tone with objective statements and I statements that place the weight of the argument on things like the research evidence or my own clinical practices, rather than on my audience. Over time, I've refined my disclaimer paragraph, which I put at the beginning of every single report after the section on the child's language background. According to the Federal Special Education Law, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, assessment materials must be selected and administered so as not to be discriminatory on a racial or cultural basis, and provided and administered in the language and form most likely to yield accurate information on what the child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally. Currently, there are no standardized tests that can accurately assess language development and disorder in students with this cultural linguistic background. To use standardized assessment scores in this evaluation would therefore be a violation of federal law. IDEA further mandates that evaluations shall not consist of less than 2 assessment measures or criteria for determining eligibility for special education services. Accordingly, this document reports the findings from an independent clinical evaluation of this student's development in Spanish and English using parent-caregiver ethnographic interview, teacher interview, clinical observations in pull-out therapy and push-in classroom settings, dynamic assessment and non-word repetition task performance, and language sample analyses. The first time I had to defend my assessment and evaluation approach was the most intimidating, but I felt strongly obligated to because of the ethical and clinical values of our profession and the skills and knowledge that I had learned. Now I share this story to show that change is possible. With this approach to change, I've been able to adhere to the best practices for assessment and evaluation of language disorders in my culturally and linguistically diverse clients. This approach has also worked with the progress reports on my treatment caseload and has made the process of increasing mandates and discharging clients from services much more efficient. I attribute this to how my justifications have been received by my colleagues. By making change a little easier, I've encountered less friction, more acceptance, and even some praise from my supervisors and special education coordinators. This success has also inspired colleagues' interest and confidence in changing their own assessment and evaluation practices. So, change is possible when we can deliver a strong argument for it.